Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with three film critics about the current state, one that I think is not too good, of film criticism in America and worldwide. And we will be starting in just a moment. Well, we're going to start this off by letting the three panelists introduce themselves. Two of the panelists I met on the Vimeo website service, and they host a local cable access television show up in Vermont, and it's called Talking About Movies. As you see on the screen, there are three people. In the bottom right, you see Bill Moranci. So I'll go with Bill first. Bill, if you could just tell a little bit about yourself, films, how you got into criticism, and a little bit about your show, because I will link to your show on Vimeo, or at least the excerpts, whatever you have online, below this video. So, Bill, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I grew up in Rhode Island, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and I became enamored of film from a very early age. I remember my father taking me to see movies when I was a boy, 5, 6 years old, some of which have left vivid impressions on me. And where I lived, I could walk to my neighborhood theater, and I could also take a bus into the downtown theaters. There were 3 movie palaces downtown in Pawtucket. And I just got hooked as a child, and to the point where by that time I was 8, 9 years old, I was going to movies by myself pretty regularly. And it just never went away from the time I was a little boy until this very moment. I mean, I've been enamored with film and have read about it and studied it and just bathed myself in it. So right now I'm currently working as a projectionist at the Savoy Film Theater, which is the theater that Rick formed in 1980, and I lead a film society at the Savoy, and do the show with Rick once a week. So that's in a very tight summary. That's where I am.
Yeah, and how many shows have you done? I think it's like 200 or more, right?
We've done about 200. We started almost exactly 5 years ago.
Okay. Rick, if you want to give a little background on yourself, similar to what Bill had said.
Sure. I grew up in the New York suburbs, Yonkers, New York. And Dan, I understand we grew up watching some of the same channels, although I'm a bit older.
Yeah.
My parents were both film buffs, so they thought nothing of taking me to see Jacques Tati when I was 6 years old, and Alec Guinness and all that. I was lucky enough to go to Columbia University as undergraduate, where there was many films to see just within walking distance, great film societies on campus, and same when I transferred to UC Berkeley. So I arrived in Vermont in the early 70s and really nowhere to see movies. I didn't know that this is what I wanted to do, but it was one of those happy instances where I said, okay, well, I guess I'll start a weekly film society. And that was 1972. That went on for 8 years. And then the opportunity to have a all 7 nights a week, one-screen movie theater presented itself. That was 1980, as Bill mentioned. The Savoy Theater, which I was co-owner and co-manager till my wife and I sold it in 2009. And since then, I'm doing a lot of film activities. The show with Bill every week. I'm teaching film history. I don't really think of myself as a film critic. I think of myself more as an appreciator. And I love sharing my interests, whether it's in Hollywood classics.
Now,
with other people. Go ahead.
If I could just ask both you and Bill, did either of you work in film? Because Bill, you say you're a projectionist. Did you ever work doing, being like a gaffer or anything?
I did one time. There was a shoot that was taking. I lived on Martha's Vineyard for 25 years, and somebody came to do a shoot there. It was a pilot for what was proposed as a television show, and I worked in props on that shoot. And it convinced me that I would never want to do that again. It was just an awful lot of sitting around waiting, read takes over and over again, watching the same lines, doing the same thing over and over again. And it just didn't work for me at all.
Okay. And Rick, when you before you bought your theater, were you involved in films as well?
Not a bit.
No.
My one exposure to a movie set was a friend from teenage years became a Hollywood director named Jonathan Kaplan, who did The Accused and White Line Fever, Heart Like a Wheel. Anyway, I was visiting Los Angeles. He invited me to come and spend the day on the set with him. It was a kind of a blaxploitation film, Truck Turner. And then I saw, as Bill said, the amount of boredom that goes along with making movies. And it just never appealed to me. I much rather enjoy showing them and talking about them afterwards.
Okay. And our final panelist is Alex Sherman. He's appeared on a couple of other film shows that I had, one on John Cassavetes, and then also regarding his book on Woody Allen. Alex, if you could just give a brief summary of you and your filmic endeavors.
I was born in Belarus. I grew up in New York City. As Dan mentioned, I'm the author of Woody Allen Reel to Reel, a pretty big book that tackles all of Woody Allen's film work from primarily a film center perspective. And unlike the other panelists, and unlike Dan, from what I know about his early life with film, I did not ever have a romantic attachment to film growing up. I didn't have much experience with movies. You know, maybe as a kid I went to a movie theater 3 or 4 times in my entire life, up until maybe I was 18 or 19 or so. And I only became interested in film as a means of kind of, I guess in a sense, getting over myself. At that point I was interested in all sorts of things, in the arts and poetry and literature. And I felt, you know, maybe that's enough. But as I grew older, I realized it's not enough. I can't simply do well with what I'm comfortable with. I have to keep going further. So in my early 20s, I started getting into film. I started reading film criticism, watching movies, and you know, very quickly I fell in love with it. I had the suspicion early on that all the arts, they have much more in common with each other than people typically think. And due to that, I needed to kind of unlock the secrets of everything, including film. And whenever I do any kind of work, whether it's this book on Woody Allen or anything in the future, there's this idea that everything coheres together, all the arts have something in common. There needs to be a common blueprint to approaching the art world as a whole, and this is really why I do film.
Or film criticism.
Film criticism, yeah, not in film, but in the future.
All right, thanks, Alex. Well, let's start off with talking about film culture, since it was mentioned a couple of times. I had sent out a recent little video that I had done of a new feature that I've got on my YouTube channel called Ask Dan Schneider, in which I basically talked a little bit about film culture. And for myself, just to give a little background, it basically deals with, and I will insert this video in between this segment and when it ends in the next segment. But basically, I was talking about the first film. It was in answer to a question someone asked about the first film I had seen, and I remember as a child going to see The Sound of Music. I think it was the 5th anniversary release. I must have been about 4. I remember Your Good Man Charlie Brown, or whatever was the first Charlie Brown film cartoon that was released. I remember going into to watch old movie theaters in New York City, where I grew up. For example, movie theaters were not like they were today. Movies would play for a year, 2 years, 2.5 years. If you got something like Love Story in 1970, you could still find it in the theaters in the summer of '72 or fall of '72. You know, it might be the cheapo theaters, and also my friends and I, we would do little things like horror, and so we would help clean the movie theaters, and 24-hour cycle in New York City. From you'd have, like it is now, from maybe 11 or 12 at noon till 12 or 1 in the morning, you'd have whatever the main features were going out. But then every theater after that, and probably 90% of them were 24-hour theaters. In order to make money, from say 1 in the morning till 6 or 7, they would have pornography, at least in my neighborhood, and all of them would show the skin flicks. And these were the arty skin flicks, you know, the Swedish stuff, the Paul Naschy stuff from Spain. And then you would also have in the mornings, from say 7 in the morning till 11, you would have old documentaries, you'd have Bugs Bunny cartoons, you would have the old Three Stooges reels, because a lot of these theaters would, in those days, wouldn't just rent the stuff. They would have these old reels that they had for 10, 15 years. So I would see Jason and the Argonauts, which came out in, I think, 59 or 60 or whatnot in 1971. And, you know, it, it's a culture that's gone, but it was good, I think, because a lot of these theater owners would save these films that Hollywood would throw away and let just rot. And a lot of the stuff that we see on DVD that has been preserved is because people have, these independent film theater owners had preserved stuff. So anyway, that's my little segue into, and I'll start with Rick, since you actually owned a theater. Does any of that sound familiar to you in terms of being a theater owner, in that there was a film culture 20, 30 years ago or more that has slowly ebbed away?
It sounds very, very familiar to me. And in fact, as you were talking, I was saying, oh, that's right. Films really did run for a long time before before anybody heard of anything such as a video window. I grew up in a film culture where, looking back on it, one of my favorite writers on film is Philip Lopate, based in Manhattan. And he was at Columbia a few years before I was. And he refers to this era of through the 1960s. He calls it the heroic age of filmmaking, of movie going. Yeah. Where it seemed as though every week there was a new Truffaut film, a new Bergman film, a new Kurosawa film. You could go to the movies and talk about it all night long. You'd go up to Boston, and still 3 years later, King of Hearts was playing at the Central Square Cinema. So this is very familiar. When when video first came in the mid 80s, some people were saying, oh, this is so wonderful because this is going to really add to film culture, because you could make your own Hitchcock series at home. You could do your own international film series at home. But I think it was a real trade-off as far as the actual going to the movies and sitting in a theater. And there are a lot of different strands that caused the decline of the film culture, starting in, I would say, the late 70s and 80s. Yeah, it's definitely one of those strands is what you were talking about.
How about you, Bill? What are your thoughts on the changing film culture from 40 or more years back?
Well, certainly all of the things that Rick just mentioned. I do remember things staying around for a long time. I also remember people going, well, until Psycho came out in 1960, people just going to the movies and walking in at any time. And then you'd stay through that feature, the next feature, maybe a newsreel. And then when you would leave, when whatever you had walked in on finally came up again, that's when you would leave.
Time to go.
Yeah, oh, this is where we came in. I mean, but since Psycho, when he said nobody should be admitted until after the film has already started, then that became the dominant ethic, and that's what people do now. It's not a big change, but it certainly is. It's a substantial change from when I was a boy.
Yeah.
You just reminded me of one of my favorite films from the 60s was one that we saw that way. It was Lonely Are the Brave with Kirk Douglas. Yeah. And I forget what was going on in my family. We were on our way back from vacation. Again, it doesn't matter where the movie is. It was right smack in the middle of the movie. Yeah. And if you remember Lonely Are the Brave, it has a very, very wrenching ending. And then to go back and see it from the beginning, when you know everything that's going to unfold. Even as a teenager, I was saying to myself, this is really not the right way to see any movie, especially a good one.
Now, Alex, since you're the youngest member of this quartet, you said you didn't have the romantic view of movies. I don't know if my or the other guys' views are necessarily romantic. Maybe they are. But what was you grew up in the 1990s and early O's? What kind of film? You talked about your own personal experience, but do you what were your friends? Were they just buying DVDs, going to the now defunct Blockbuster? What was the culture when you were growing up?
Here's the thing. So, I mean, you guys have insight into the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. I'm cut off even, as early as, or rather as late as the 80s. And my insight into it, there's basically two things going on. On the one hand, there's things that society is doing, that Hollywood is doing. There's also younger people who are reacting to it. Now, from the perspective of Hollywood, there's been this kind of direction towards bigger blockbusters, bigger films, things that tackle subjects other than normal, mature adult subjects. And when you do this, when you take this sort of approach, what happens in the long run is you're going to eventually alienate a large number of adults, or perhaps even younger people who have these kinds of intellectual inclinations but can't find it through film. If we have TV everywhere now, and if we want to merely sit at home and kill ourselves with some shitty show, we're able to do that. We have that option. We don't have to go to the movies to see some blockbuster, because essentially we could get the same kind of cheap thrill sitting at home. But Hollywood is going more and more towards these kinds of cheap thrills. They're losing a lot of money on it, but that's their stake in it, and this is the youthful reaction. On the other hand, when I was about maybe 15, 16, and I was first getting into, I guess, deeper topics, when I was getting into politics and history and literature and art and all these things and philosophy, I saw movies as a cheap, entertaining outlet, because everything that was around me, there were either wannabe films, films that want to be deep, like Brokeback Mountain or Crash, or whatever trash that you could think of that people associate with this is a great film, or Steven Spielberg, this is what depth looks like. But I saw it for what it was. It wasn't very deep to me. So I had the option between if I'm done working for the day and I don't feel like reading, I don't feel like engaging intellectually. If I have the choice between a bad film and a video game, I'm gonna take the video game every time. And this is the key thing. A lot of people my age, I don't know anybody my age that has not experienced video games growing up. This replaced the film culture quite a bit, because if you're not producing something that is essentially different from video games, and most of these blockbusters are not intellectually different from video games, they're at the same low level, you're not going to have kids that will say, I'd rather go see the film than stay at home. I'm going to choose video games every time, including even today, although I don't even play anymore. Give me a choice between a piece of trash and a video game, I take the video game, because at least I could get some kind of, I guess, low-level engagement out of it, and you can't do that with a bad film. If you're not going to have adult films, if you refuse to tackle mature topics, if you don't want to treat adults as adults and pretend that they actually exist out there, you're not going to have a rich film culture. And you have all this diffusion, you have all these other social outlets, you have all these other things that people could do now growing up since the 90s. You're not going to have film working out very well for you if that's going to be the approach that you take.
Well, you bring up a good point, and let me turn back to the older fellas who go back with me. We talk about blockbusters now, the Michael Bay kind of thing. Just from, when I mentioned, I think before we got started, or maybe early, I mentioned Love Story. And to me, Love Story was maybe the first big blockbuster movie that I can recall that sort of just was saturated. You guys are a little bit older. Maybe there were a few others. Maybe the Cleopatra with Liz Taylor. But you had the seven mentality. You had the Love Story. You had The Exorcist. You had The Godfather. You had Jaws. You had Star Wars. And as that went on, yeah, you could still have you could have a Godfather be a blockbuster, but you don't really get masterful films now that are making $1 billion. You get Batman superhero films. You get Aliens meets Predators meets Arnold Schwarzenegger's grandmother. Talk about what you think before we get into actual film criticism. What the role of the blockbuster and sort of the pushing out of American art films we don't have, for example, Fellini anymore. We don't have, we've got maybe Terrence Malick, Woody Allen, who's hit and miss for the last 20 plus years. Scorsese is not what he was years ago. Talk to me about what you think the blockbusters did to cinema, you guys. Either one of you, Bill or Rick.
Well, go ahead. Want to take it?
I'll just one quick thought was that what Jaws in particular ushered in the 70s. People ask me if I went to film school, and my answer was, when I was in college, there were only 2 film schools, or 3. If you were in New York, there was NYU, or if you were in the West Coast, there was USC or UCLA. That was basically it. And I think what the age of the blockbuster, Jaws and Star Wars did was it created what I think of as the film school generation, that Lucas and Spielberg and their friends got so much publicity for what they were doing that many colleges said, oh, well, maybe this is something we ought to look into. And people like Spielberg and Lucas, who having been born at another time, might have become really top flight studio directors, instead latched onto this new thing. Thinking of Star Wars, an analogy to Star Wars in the 40s might have been something that filled out a double bill in your local neighborhood theater.
Yeah.
And now it became, this is what our talented filmmakers are going to be doing, and this is what people are going to be seeing. So I think in that way, the coming of the blockbuster eroded a certain kind of film culture, just as far as who was now going into big Hollywood movies.
Bill, your comment?
Yeah, I want to address something that Alex was talking about. I quite agree that the blockbuster has caused Hollywood and the studio process to devolve into junk. But quite frankly, Alex, I completely ignore what happens at Hollywood. We have a theater here in Montpelier that has 5 screens, and they play what I call explosion movies. And that draws the 18 to 24-year-olds. And that whole segment of film world, I completely ignore. And I bear in mind, I watch a movie almost every day, and I see, it's been my observation and my experience that every year there are about somewhere between 5 and 10 top-notch, really high-quality films that satisfy me on virtually every level, aesthetically and philosophically and socially, and all the different ways that a film can touch your heart and touch your mind. And I see it as my job to try and find those 5 films that come out every year, no matter where they come from. Some of those we play at the Savoy, but some of the ones that I find never even came to the Savoy. They play at festivals here, play at festivals there, and I see film world right now as immensely rich, but not necessarily popular. We're not talking about a lot of money that's being made by movies like Dogtooth, or you could just name them. I mean, they come out every single year, as I say. And so the blockbuster phenomenon, I think, is going to play itself out. Even 18-year-olds, the ones that I work with at the Savoy, the Candy Girls, they say they're sick of the explosion movies because, after you've seen 25, 30, 40 of them, they're essentially all the same. The same gags, the same structure, the same garbage. And they don't satisfy. They're just like surface flash that maybe makes your jaw drop while you're watching it, and you walk out and you might as well never have seen it.
Well, sequelitis went hand in hand with the blockbuster. I mean, you have Fast and Furious 17 now, or whatever it is. Alex, you have a brief comment?
James Bond 25.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, this is the same movie over and over again.
Just to comment on what Bill said, as far as 5 to 10 good movies coming out every year, I think that's probably accurate. There's at the very least, there's probably a handful of great films that come out every year. We probably don't have access to it perpetually, but, they are out there. The function of criticism is to highlight why the good is good, why the bad is bad and to help whatever it is that deserves to be helped, so that in the future, the culture could get moved along and people could do something with it down the line. I mean, I think of, for example, somebody like Herman Melville. I mean, Moby Dick was published in what, 1851, and it took about 70, 80 years before the book ever reached public consciousness. If it trickled into the imagination from the 1815s onwards, we probably would have saved ourselves a lot of bad art that came in between. Because the culture could have been affected by something that was ahead of its time then, instead of going through a lot of pointless experimentation in the interim. So the function of criticism, whether it's something small like working at a movie theater or writing books or whatever it might be, you want to propel that which deserves it. You want culture to be affected by what needs to be affected and not afflicted by the wrong stuff.
Yeah, well, let's segue now from talking about the film culture and blockbusters, one at the film criticism itself. And obviously, you two guys, as a couple of guys talking about films, it's patterned on the famed sort of format that was started 40 plus years ago. I think it was in 74, 75 that Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel of two Chicago newspapers started. I believe the first show was called Sneak Previews. I could be wrong. And then it became At the Movies, and then it became Siskel and Ebert at the Movies, and then just Siskel and Ebert. A lot of people have, and I've talked about Roger Ebert before. He actually wrote an article on me some years ago. But you had Siskel was sort of seemingly the more cerebral of the two. Ebert was the more emotional one. They constantly bickered about this and that, and it became a kind of shtick. Once they left PBS, they got the thumbs up and thumbs down kind of thing. A lot of people have thought that they were good for films because they popularized them. Other people have thought that Siskel and Ebert helped with the decline of film culture, with the sort of kind of mindlessness, because a lot of the imitators especially became just sort of hucksters for whatever Hollywood garbage was being put out there. Let me just ask Rick and Bill first. What are your views of Siskel and Ebert, the show, the tandem, and their impact on film and film culture?
Okay,
Go ahead, Bill.
this time. I thought they had a very positive effect on film awareness. I also disagree with your characterization of our show. That's not exactly what Rick and I set out to do. It's not what we actually do.
Yeah.
We don't see ourselves as like Siskel and Ebert. What we're doing is we are mutually celebrating film. And I see it as our job, and I think Rick does as well, to bring to people's attention films that they either didn't know about, and show them clips, give them some sense of what it looks like, what it feels like, what the tone of it is, and perhaps even reintroduce them to things that they may have seen or known about at one point in the past, but have forgotten about. For me, one of the most gratifying parts of this show that we do is when someone will stop me on the street and say, oh, I saw your show, and then I went out and got that movie, and boy, that was really good, And we're just trying to bring to people's attention some of the outstanding work that's been done. I've also, both Rick and I've taught film history mostly on the high school level, and I see that, again, is just bringing to the young people's attention the work that's been done. And it's not all like Star Wars, and it's not all explosion stuff. I mean, there's some very thoughtful, and some wonderful work that's been done. And I tell the kids when I begin the course that you will find in film every other art form represented. And I think it is the preeminent art form of our time because it incorporates literature, it incorporates music, it incorporates everything else, sculpture, posing, tableau, all of that. All of that is in film, as well as thought and philosophy. So, I think it is the art form of our time. And I just want people here in Montpelier and now through our video channel, people elsewhere, to sort of appreciate just what a resource this is.
Rick?
Yeah, I'll stick in my 2 cents about Siskel and Ebert. One of the best documentaries I saw this past year was Life Itself, about Roger Ebert. And it caused me to reconsider my feelings about that show, which for years I was thinking, oh, that's part of the dumbing down of film criticism. Everything devolves to one thumb. The subtlety is lost. You might want to see a movie that it's that kind of doesn't work, but has a lot going for it. But there is an aspect of Ebert, especially, that came across in this film, is that he was an appreciator and a champion of films that really should be seen more. And there are so many young filmmakers who really making their films, getting their films a higher profile. So I have mixed feelings about their show. Tremendous admiration for Ebert as a thinker and a critic, and we need more of him, frankly.
Alex, any comment?
So I agree to some degree that it helped to dumb down film criticism, but part of that has to do with just the inevitable effect of any kind of demotic culture. If you democratize anything, including art, it's going to tend towards LCD. Everything exists in the human spectrum and in the universe on a kind of bell curve, and it's inevitable that if you take an approach like this, the more people that attracts, the more films that are made, the more that people go to the movies, you're going to tap into this, wide middle ground of mediocrity. That's simply what happens. At the same time, you could also argue that it probably does bring certain people into the fold that otherwise might not have been so interested in film. For example, if I had not come across, Dan's criticism in my early 20s, I probably would not have been that into film even to this day. People need to be brought into the fold because they have potentials that need to be tapped into. That said, even if Ebert was often wrong in his criticism, or if Siskel wasn't the greatest writer or articulator of his opinions, if you probably look at the history of film criticism in general, and if you have to pick, 2 or 3 people, Ebert and Siskel are probably your better choices. If you have a choice between Ebert versus Bosley Crowther, Ebert is definitely better. Manny Farber versus Ebert is better. A hack like Rosenbaum who can't even write versus Ebert, who might be wrong but could at least write, and sometimes extremely well, you're going to pick Ebert. And then Siskel, the plus for him is that he was at the very least somewhat consistent. With Ebert, he might have a certain viewpoint in a film, and you have no idea what he will think of another film because he doesn't necessarily have that much of a system. He could praise, something that was terrible. He could attack something that was great. So you don't really know where he's coming from. But with Siskel, there's that predictability in the good sense. And I think this is something that is very often lost in criticism. Most critics are, in the bad sense of the word, completely unpredictable. Siskel had that going for him, that he had the consistent judgment that you could sort of fall back on to an extent.
Well, let's talk about sort of the consistency. I know I've often written about not only just film criticism but other types of criticism as well. I think people in general, film goers and also film critics, fall into a trap, what I call the like-dislike axis versus the good-bad axis. When I ask someone, is it a good film? I'm not asking if they liked it, because there are bad films I like. I grew up watching Godzilla films from the 60s in rubber suits. I grew up watching, 50s sci-fi schlock films on Creature Feature and Chiller Theater in New York as a kid. My heart, but I know they're crap. I like Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's funny as hell, but it's a terrible film. And then there are films that are well made. There are a few Ingmar Bergman films that just don't emotionally get to me. So let me just ask, and I'll start with Rick and Bill again. Do you guys make a difference in when you're on your show talking about what you like versus what's good? as I just delineated with, say, Godzilla and crappy schlock sci-fi films that I like versus Bergman films that I don't particularly like? Or what is your own sort of critical métier that you use?
I'll start, Bill. Um, I'll come back. I'll come back to that word appreciation. And our show, we're not, quote, reviewing current films. We're not even reviewing older films. We are perhaps taking a theme that occurs in various films. We're paying tribute to a certain actor, a director. One of our favorite shows, and I think Bill told me it was one of our most watched on Vimeo, was a tribute to a writer who not many people have heard of, named Cornell Woolrich, who under various pseudonyms turned out to have created the source material for many, 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 many films, including Rear Window and The Bride Wore Black. And I just saw a great one for a great noir film the other night called Phantom Lady. And so what these movies all have in common is something to capture a viewer's attention. To say, oh, well, maybe I dismissed that film as schlock, but there are these good performances. There are these themes that run through it. As Bill said, we're trying to alert people to the richness of this art form. And we occasionally will do a film that, did we actually do a show that was called Guilty Pleasures?
Yes, we
I
did.
think maybe so. I have a very big fondness for Gremlins too. It's like I forget which critic or film writer said it, but in every bad film, you can find at least 5 good minutes.
Yeah.
Something that you can latch onto. Again, appreciation is the key. Making connections in film history, seeing actors at the start of their careers, at the very end of their careers, and also appreciating how much work goes into a film. Could be great. A cinematographer has saved the day for a director. The editor has saved the day for the scriptwriter, along those lines.
All right, Bill.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, Bill, how about you?
Well, I'll pass on one thought. One of the things that this film society that I've been running for the last couple of years has taught me is an old aphorism that we see things not as they are, but as we are. I mean, I will play films that have a certain ambiguity because I think that's what generates the best discussion in the group. And I hear 15, 20 people voicing thoughts after this movie is over, and it clearly reflects who they are. And because that's what film will do. I mean, it acts as a multifaceted mirror, and we see things as we are. I also want to mention that until I was 18, I used to go to the movies because just for pure pleasure. And then when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman in college at UMass in Amherst, and I went into the Amherst cinema, and I watched The Virgin Spring by Bergman. And it was the first time I had ever seen a movie that rocked me, not just in an emotional sense, but in an intellectual sense. And when I got home that night, back to my room that night, I couldn't sleep. I was pacing and pacing and pacing, trying to parse out that all the different facets, all the different levels of that film. And that was when I first realized that this is as valid as any work of literature I had read by that point in my life. And this is rich stuff. And that was the film that gave it to me.
Okay, Alex, any comment from you?
Specifically on the like-dislike axis, I think at the beginning, when I first got into art in general, I probably could not differentiate between like and dislike, because whenever something touched me emotionally or by any other means, I would latch onto it. I would consider it a great work of art. Eventually, I was able to kind of finesse through that and understand that if there's many things that I might have attachments to that are not necessarily good on their own terms. They don't necessarily have merit. You know, there's Schwarzenegger films that I love that aren't very good. There's video games that I grew up playing that, you know, they don't have intellectual substance. At the same time, I feel like the older that you get, the more that these kinds of emotional attachments tend to wane, at least for me. So even if there's something that I might not be so attached to emotionally at the beginning, if it's a great work of art, if it's intellectually compelling and so on and so forth, I'm still eventually going to be emotionally invested into it in some way. And this is partly due to the fact that you can reach the human heart through the mind, but you can't always reach the mind by the human heart alone. In fact, you can never reach the human mind purely on heart alone. You know, you need something else to it. That's what differentiates us between other animals. So I think the older that you get, this sort of thing tends to collapse on itself. And, you know, I would hope that as people mature, they tend to find greatness kind of more in tune with who they are and what kind of values they have. And, you know, just you notice this in big things, you notice this in all sorts of little things as well. The older that you get, you just tend to become attached to what is great. I could watch a really devastating film, something that could be really, really sad, something that could be difficult to watch, and I could be smiling throughout the whole time, or I could be crying, you know, tears of happiness the whole time, despite the fact that I should be sad. And that's because there's something going on there aesthetically and intellectually that is moving me in a way that, you know, perhaps I should not be moved, you know, in the ethical realm or whatever else, but I'm being moved for far deeper reasons. You know, so I would hope the older that I get, this thing tends to collapse more and more on itself.
All right, well, let's end this segment. And in our next segment, let's talk a little bit about the history of film criticism. We mentioned Bosley Crowther, we talked about Pauline Kael, we'll talk about the new wave and maybe the Cahiers de Cinema type thing. And we'll do that in just a moment. Ask Dan Schneider. This is Dan Schneider, and on this Ask Dan Schneider, I'm going to be answering a general question that I've gotten, again, over a decade and a half of Cosmoetica being online. I've probably gotten hundreds, if not maybe 1,000 times. It's one of those general questions many people get, and that is, what is the first film or movie that you recall seeing, and, you know, did you like it? Of course, there are variations that I'll probably do, like what's the best film, what's the worst film. But I picked What's the First Film because this current weekend that I'm recording, this upcoming weekend that I'm recording this, I'm going to be doing a show on film criticism and why film criticism is so bad on my Dan Schneider video interview. And it got me thinking about the lost culture of film and how when I was a kid, one of the first jobs I had would be sweeping up movie theaters, sweeping up you know, the crumbs and whatnot after a show so that me and my friends who did it would get free passes to see movies. And the great thing about it was in New York growing up, in the outer boroughs, all the movie theaters there were open 24 hours. You would have, in the very early mornings from about 1 a.m. to 6 or 7 a.m., you'd have pornography, the pornos. Overnight, all theaters were porno theaters. Then from maybe 7 to 11 a.m., you'd have the kids' fair, old serials, movie serials, old Daffy Duck, Warner Brothers stuff, Popeye cartoons, and other fare like that. Then you would have, and also including some, documentaries, old documentaries and whatnot. Then you'd have from maybe 11 a.m. or noon till midnight or 1 in the morning, you'd have whatever movies were playing there. I remember things like the Planet of the Apes films. But anyway, the first film that I can recall is one of two films. And again, I'm assuming movie theater. If we're talking first movies I ever saw, that probably was on TV, and there's probably maybe a Three Stooges short. It might have been an Abbott and Costello movie on WPIX Channel 11 in New York as a kid growing up on Sundays at 11:30 to 1. All the old Abbott and Costello movies played. So they may have been the first movies that I actually saw, or it could have been something like, the old Universal monster films. But as for in the theater, I believe it was one of two films. It might have been You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, because that left a great big impression on me. It's the cartoon version. And I think it was the cartoon version where Charlie goes to like summer camp or something. And if it wasn't that, at about 3 or 4 years old, whenever that came out in 68 or 69, it may have been The Sound of Music in re-release, a 5th anniversary re-release at Radio City Music Hall. And the reason I remember it was because my mom and dad took me into Manhattan. It was a big occasion, and we passed by a construction site which was going to be the Twin Towers. The World Trade Center was just being built then. It was just started. So this was probably in mid to late 69, I believe. I think the construction had just started for the Twin Towers. And I remember seeing Julie Andrews and the screen and her big face, with the hills are alive with the sound of music. She did it much better, of course. But I remember seeing how big her face was, 40 feet high on a big screen, and how pretty she was. Not beautiful, not gorgeous, not sexy, just pretty. Just something very inviting about Julie Andrews. And the image of Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music, a film which I will one day have to review, still sticks with me. Now, The Sound of Music is not a great film, I don't believe. You could argue it's a great musical. It's a great genre film in that sense. And I've never been big on musicals. And there's certainly musical numbers in You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. But those are likely the first two movies that I ever saw in a movie theater. And I would have been 3 or 4. It was about a year later, when I was about 5, that I first started doing the cleaning up in movie theaters to see films. I remember seeing Godzilla's Revenge in the theaters, movie theaters. I remember seeing Jason and the Argonauts, because when I talked about kids' movies and fair old movies being replayed in the mornings, that's often what you'd see, Ray Harryhausen type films. The films from the 60s. There would be the Eurotrash porno films, as I mentioned, Paul Naschy type films. There was a film culture, a 24/7 hour film culture, and there were so many really good and different films in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was a cornucopia, and yes, now we have the internet, now we have video games, now we have cable TV and all this stuff, but God, there was something about going to a theater, sitting down in the dark and watching that you just can't get anywhere, especially when you had a really good film. I remember a few years ago watching Jason and reviewing Jason and the Argonauts, the DVD, and in the extra features, Tom Hanks says something along the lines, or he's quoted as saying that when he was a kid, the greatest movie in the world was Jason and the Argonauts, and I knew that. I understood exactly what it was. I remember the bronze man, the giant bronze statue coming down. I remember, I think it was the Battle of the Skeletons, or it might have been Jason and the Argonauts, or Sinbad the Sailor. I forget which one. I think Jason had the single skeleton that came alive, and Sinbad maybe had the 7. But anyway, getting back to Charlie Brown and The Sound of Music, one of these days I hope I'll be able to interview the gal who was in The Sound, who later went on into Lost in Space, whose name slips my mind right now. She was Angela Cartwright, that's right. She was also on Make Room for Daddy. Anyway, The Sound of Music sticks in my mind. I was a little boy going to Manhattan to Radio City Music Hall with my mom and my dad, and everything for a brief while was good. This was maybe a month or two before my sister Christine was adopted. I remember it. I remember it well. Maybe it's not a true memory. Maybe it's 50% my memory or 25%, and a lot of what my mom told me. Maybe it's a lot of filler. I was an only child, and my sister hadn't been adopted. But I remember the sound of music. I remember the movies, and it was a good feeling back then. All right. In this segment, I'd like to take a step back and talk about film criticism a bit more historically. We mentioned a few older names. Film started in the early 1900s, and I don't think that there was any. I could be wrong, but I don't think there was any big name critics in the 20s or 30s. Usually, it was whatever the L.A. Times or the Washington Post or the New York Times said about a film that sort of became the 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 model for what people thought about a film. And then around the mid-century, then Bosley Crowther a little bit maybe changed up. New York Times. Bosley Crowther was pretty much synonymous. You said the New York Times disliked Spartacus. Well, 95 out of 100 times you're talking about Bosley Crowther. Then you had the Pauline Kaels in the 1960s. She came along. Then you had the Ebert and Siskel and some of the younger guys of the 80s, Jeffrey Lyons, those kinds of people. So let's talk about the history of film criticism, at least in the U.S., and then we'll expand a little bit a bit back out into world cinema. So when you guys were growing up, both Bill and Rick, did you ever read what was said about a film, or did you just go to whatever movie you like, or did you get recommendations? And what did a Crowther or the opinion of a Crowther or someone like him mean to you guys, if anything?
Well, I have to say that just the mention of the name Bosley Crowther brings back my childhood. I'm one of the few people who might be able to say that. My parents were faithful New York Times readers. And I think from the age of 12, I was a movie reviewer reader. So his word was gold as far as what was worth seeing. It was only as I started reading Stanley Kaufman in the New Republic, who would just rip apart films that Crowther loved, and vice versa. And one of Crowther's controversial reviews from the early 60s was of Dr. Strangelove. He was really offended by the humor in it. Yeah. Says, I'd like to know what this picture proves when everybody is shown to be such an idiot. And there was somebody like Stanley Kaufman saying, this is a brilliant piece of work. And Kaufman in the New Republic, Dwight MacDonald, who is reviewing in Esquire. And I think that was a big light bulb for me, that people could really disagree like this and really write about films, not necessarily for a popular, for the, as Alex used the word, demotic, as for the masses. And then getting one level deeper, then you start to discover the people who are off in a corner writing in the 30s and 40s. And one person who I really came to admire after reading a lot of references to him was Otis Ferguson, who wrote for The Nation mag. No, I think he was in the New Republic in the late 30s and early 40s. And as I got into Hollywood classics, let's see what Otis Ferguson said about Mr. Deeds Goes to Town when it came out. It was invariably so well written, great humor. He was unfortunately killed in World War II. But then there were people of that era like James A.G., who was writing for both Time and The Nation. And his reviews are great to go back to. And I've used Ferguson and A.G. many times to put those Hollywood movies from the 30s and 40s on my list to check out. So it turns out to be a kind of a rich history. And Alex mentioned Manny Farber earlier. I'm not a particular fan of his. He was a very kind of idiosyncratic He was just all over the place, but a great writing stylist. And then as a teenager and college student, I also discovered Andrew Sarris writing in the Village Voice. And those were the people who really alerted me to that there are many, many aspects of criticism, many ways to look at a movie. And one, when I was teaching at community college in the mid-'70s, I remember one exercise that I did with the class. And this was all a 16 millimeter film. Nobody, video is still some years in the future. I showed Robert Altman's film Thieves Like Us with Keith Carradine and Shelley Duvall. A film that I have some fondness for, and I know that many people have different ways of reacting to that film. Anyway, we saw the film, out Things to Read, a complete slam by, I forget what critic, just tore it apart. And then a review by Pauline Kael, who loved it to pieces. And I had them read both those reviews and then see the movie again and talk about what, what from those reviews stayed with them as far as approaching the movie again. It was a great lesson in what can be seen in a movie and what criticism can do.
Bill, how about you?
As a child, I don't remember reading film criticism specifically. I do remember Judith Crist, because I think she was published in some magazine that my family got. It wasn't until I got to college and then afterwards that I began reading people like Pauline Kael, who I was very fond of, even though I disagreed with her almost always. But I love the way she described her feelings and the way she took a film. And believe it or not, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I really liked reading John Simon back in the 60s and 70s. I thought he was a very good writer and a very perceptive critic, even though his personal attacks on actors and directors and people in the industry I found repulsive. I still thought his analyses were spot on, at least as far as I could see. And as an adult, as a continuing adult, I don't read, who do I read now? I read, Ebert until he died, of course, who I also thought was a wonderful writer, much too kind, too good-hearted, because I think he felt too much empathy, in my opinion, for filmmakers. He could have been more critical, I thought, many, many times. But nobody really stands out to me now as someone who I would trust.
Yeah. I know it's often been said, there used to be websites 5-10 years ago, I remember 2 or 3 of them that tracked the 4-star reviews that Ebert had given out, and he was giving out more 4-star reviews in the late 90s and O's than he did back in, say, the 60s and 70s when the so-called new wave and golden age of the new Hollywood was at its height. So I've always found that interesting. Alex, since you can look back with more detachment, when you look back and read the Crowthers and the Kaels and the Farbers and all these other people that were mentioned, what do you look at it with some distance? What do you think?
Well, first, the comment about detachment. The fact is, when I first got into literature and film and the arts as a whole, these names to me, and also these names to artsy, youngsters, they're absolutely meaningless. Bosley Crowther, he means absolutely nothing to me. Pauline Kael, nothing. Rosenbaum, nothing. They're just a big void. So if I were to go to watch a film and read, one of their reviews, to me it's like any other name, despite their, reputations, any other name saying whatever it is that they say about the film, very often being either quite wrong or just very poor at articulating the actual thoughts. Now, before I get specific, I want to be a little more general for a second. I think in general, criticism, not just in film, but the arts as a whole, has been historically, from the time of Aristotle up until now, pretty terrible. And it's been terrible despite the fact that the arts have grown. So we had, you could argue, at least to an extent, some great writing during the Greek period. We had, perhaps some great writing, maybe some individual poems, maybe sections of the Aeneid, maybe sections of Lucretius. We had great writing during the Roman period. We had great writing during the classical Chinese period in the Tang Dynasty. But at the same time, there was never any kind of criticism that was able to match the quality of the art being put out. It was almost as if there was this disconnect. You had artists on the one hand creating art, not really understanding what they were doing, not being able to articulate it logically, but going on instinct and instinct alone. And then you had people that were usually not artists themselves, but were somehow on the outside looking in, taking whatever it is that they took from the art, but not really being able to break down what makes the art work. And on some level, you could say this improved a little bit historically. I would say poetry. I would say that of all the older critics, probably Edgar Allan Poe had some of the best writing about poetry in the 1800s. But the more that time went on, you had more and more great art, and criticism was simply not improving. And I think the reason for this is the following. Artists have always been working purely on instinct. Critics who were looking at this kind of purely instinctual art, they had nothing to really go by. They themselves couldn't apply logic. I think it's only very recently that people are able to look at a film, and even if they happen to pass the wrong judgments or whatnot, they're able to look at a film, they're able to read a poem, they're able to read a book, and they're able to pull out lines, they're able to pull out, fragments and say, this works, this does not work, and this is why. This is a fairly recent phenomenon, but logic has not fully caught up to it. People still have basic issues with evidence and argumentation. And if you look at Bosley Crowther, Rick mentioned, for example, his review of Dr. Strangelove, it's completely littered with things like this is a dangerous film, it is too grim, what is it saying if everybody's an idiot, what is it saying politically? It's like, even if it were a dangerous film, even if it were saying absolutely wrong things about society, the fact is, Bosley Crowther is trying to apply his own ideological biases onto the film itself, which is kind of disconnected from the sort of world that he wants there to exist. And instead of seeing the work for the work and in the details and so on, he sees it for what it lacks, ideologically. You see the same thing in Rosenbaum. You see a lot of this in Pauline Kael, and Bill mentioned, Pauline Kael being a good writer. I strongly disagree with this. I think she was, besides being wrong in her judgments, I think she was a horrific writer. In fact, Renata Adler, who wasn't that much of a better critic anyway, she did this really long piece where she kind of, ripped into all of these lines that Pauline Kael would have that really come out of nowhere, that are, poorly phrased, that don't mean anything, that are just there to sort of, kind of stir the pot, yet in ways that don't even make sense logically. I don't think that criticism has had a very good run. A lot of this has to do with basic issues of evidence and argumentation. People simply are not even able to follow the basic threads of their own thought. Very often, a critic would say, here's something that happens in the film. This is an example of a terrible script, or this is an example of a great line, and they would end up quoting a cliche. They would end up providing evidence that goes completely against the thing that they're arguing. Sometimes they contradict themselves within their own passages. I have many examples of this with Rosenbaum, Pauline Kael, where they basically, they argue one thing, but then they end up arguing the exact opposite a few minutes later, a few lines later, and they have no idea that they're doing this. They have so little control over their own ideas. They have so little control over any kind of system that they could, put film under, that they have no idea what they're doing, literally from paragraph to paragraph. This has been a basic problem from the beginning. It was a problem with Aristotle and poetics. It was a problem with Nietzsche and the birth of tragedy. It's still going to be a problem now. And I don't see any critics, for the most part, that have been able to sidestep this issue.
Okay, let me just let's pull back, and I want to talk a little bit about world cinema. And one point I did want to mention, I think, since we've mentioned some of these names like the James Agees and some of these other people from the 60s. I think it was Siskel and Ebert that basically were the final thing that severed the critic from whatever source he was writing for or criticizing from. That Ebert himself became a celebrity. Siskel became a celebrity, whereas Crowther and Cale still were attached to their respective publications. I just want to throw that out. Anyway, I think the worst critical movements was in France, the Cahiers du Cinema movement, which later spilled out into the French wave and all the young filmmakers of the late 50s, early 60s. Read a lot of Cahiers criticism. It's very pallid. It's usually films are judged on their political content rather than their artistic content, and yet it did have some good films. And I think the new wave, as it sort of went around the world, hitting Japan and then coming back to what was called the new Hollywood in the 60s, I think it did probably have an overall good movement, a good impression, but I think it was sort of accidental. Rick or Bill, do you want to talk about Cahiers du Cinema and the new wave and its effect on criticism and film?
I have read about Cahiers, but I have never actually read Cahiers.
Okay.
I know that it was very influential, and I know that it was influential as far as helping to introduce American audiences to their own directors. I think that, John Ford and Howard Hawks, Hitchcock to some extent, were, the best of a bunch of technicians in Hollywood. And it was the French critics who elevated them to, let's take a look at these movies, or, and you see Peter Bogdanovich, kind of, who was a film curator before he became a writer and director, was using the example of Hawks as using Hawks as an example, who by the late 50s, early 60s, you could barely see any of his movies anywhere. It was Bogdanovich who put on the first big Hawks retrospective at MoMA in the 60s. So I have some respect for the Cahiers writers as far as their enthusiasm, their passion. Of course, when you start to read about how an individual movie was put together, you find out that their cult of the director as auteur does not necessarily hold up with every case. And, I recently read, and Bill might have read it too, a biography of Nicholas Ray, the director, and before that, it was Bill who loaned me the book about a book about Warren Beatty, and it kind of puts the whole auteur theory to it kind of explodes it in a way when you learn that this particular movie, Nicholas Ray was such a psychotic mess that the producer had to take over, the writer had to take over. In the book about Beatty, you find out that Shampoo, which was a movie that Pauline Kael loved, and she loved everything that Hal Ashby did with Shampoo. Well, it turns out, if you believe this biography, that Ashby was not in any shape to really direct much of that movie, that Beatty was actually the man in charge. Anyway, we've drifted away from Cahiers to the auteur theory. But the French New Wave, which was spurred on by a lot of these young people who first wrote for Cahiers before they turned their hands to cinema, I think we're still feeling the reverberations of the French New Wave as it spread to Czechoslovakia, as it spread to England, as the young people in Hollywood working in the 70s used that as a model. And just last year, the Noah Baumbach film, Frances Ha, was its own homage to the French New Wave. I can't speak about the substance of Kaye, but
How about you, Bill?
French influence certainly is a great.
Yeah, I never read it either. But I want to pick up on a thought that Alex picked up on. He said that making art is intuitive, which is true, of course. So is film appreciation. I don't think film appreciation is necessarily an intellectual process. As I sit down and watch a movie, I always sit down with my hopes high, and I watch the thing, and there's a myriad of experiences going on between what's going on the screen and what's going on in my mind. And what I find is that if all of the cylinders are clicking, if nothing's clunking, nothing's offending me or hurting the or if the story is working for me, about a half hour in, I feel my heart stop to beat a little bit faster. And I hope beyond hope that feeling carries through the entire film. And when it does, then you've got one of the 5 films that I talked about when I spoke earlier. And I think what criticism is the elaborate rationalizations that we come up with after the fact to try and explain, partly to ourselves, why we felt the way we did. And because you're taking something which is so complex and so amorphous as it's washing through you and through your mind and through your gut, where our criticism is, I think, an inadequate and maybe even a pathetic attempt to try and capture what that experience is. So it's the best we can do, but I sort of agree with him that it's not good enough, but it's never going to be good enough, because in order to record all the complexity that happens second by second, not just minute by minute, second by second when the film is going by. Yeah, Terrence Malick film is a good example. You know, you're watching these visuals, and then what's the thought behind it? Who is this character? What does he represent? All that stuff. It barrages you with impressions and thoughts that feel like a rich experience inside your mind. And then afterwards, I try and write down, okay, what did that do for me? And I can only do so much. I can only write so much. I can only remember so much. But I remember the feeling. And I remember when it worked. I remember that very well. And those are the films that I show in my film society.
Okay.
So that's it.
Alex.
And that's before I let Alex just add one thought that is why I really respect film writers. I think David Denby is one. I think Godfrey Cheshire is certainly another one, who can take a film and say, I had really mixed feelings about this film, and then go on for 3 pages about the nature of their mixed feelings. Whereas perhaps you and I, Bill, would just say, well, I like this, but I didn't like that. I kind of had mixed feelings about this film, leave it at a paragraph. So anyway, over to you, Alex.
Just to comment on what Bill said before I get to Cahiers du Cinema, the idea that art is created intuitively, I think this has been the case historically. My point in saying that, however, was to bring attention to the fact that that's been historically a flaw. You need to have a combination of intuition, right? Things that you can't quite put into words. You know, you sometimes do things in a book or a poem or whatever that you don't exactly know why you're doing, but ends up working. On the other hand, you need logic. You need to be able to use logic to discipline instinct. You know, this urge to create, it does come from something that is difficult to define, but unless you have a way to polish it and finesse it, you're going to go about it in an undisciplined way. This is why you could have, you know, poets that could have a truly great poem, you know, a classic, you know, next to something that is completely ridden with cliches. You could have a filmmaker with a great film next to something that's just absolutely atrocious. That's because whatever instinct that they have, even if it's a good instinct overall, if it's not being disciplined by the overmind, that's a problem in the long run. And you know, criticism has had that problem. While art has moved a little bit into the logical territory to an extent. Criticism has not. It's still stuck in the intuitive realm, and that's a problem in the long run. The other thing that Bill mentioned is, as far as being able to see everything in a film or any work of art really, or anything in life, to a degree, I agree with Bill. You cannot see anything. That's the definition of being human. The human brain is adapted to reality, a very specific kind of reality on planet Earth. By definition, it's not adapted to, so many other realities elsewhere, or, things that, or higher consciousness. It evolved to help us survive. It didn't evolve to help us, understand film and create art. That is, a kind of a approximate use that we put it to, right? That's not the ultimate cause of consciousness. That's not the reason. At the same time, it is a mistake to say that simply because you cannot see everything that you cannot see. Of course we could see. The reason why we survive, the reason why we're able to act in logical ways, the reason why there's often such a good relationship between our efforts versus what we get out of life is because we are able to see, we are able to look at what is there essentially. I don't think you could, in a truly great work of art, I don't think people at this point are capable of a work of art, in a way that's, so super detailed and scholarly that gets at absolutely everything, because we're limited. At the same time, you could do much better than the criticism that has been occurring thus far. And that's really the point. You don't want to see everything. That shouldn't necessarily be the end goal. What you need to see is you need to see intelligently. You need to see essentially. You need to know what to look for, and you need to do consistently over and over and over again. Now, going to Cahiers du Cinema, I think I actually have read a good amount of the actual reviews, both from the 50s and into actually more contemporary reviews. The style has changed. Dan said that they were ideological from the start in terms of politics. They weren't actually political from the very beginning. They became more political in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Then they became very kind of postmodern, and they went through a number of kind of internal changes for that reason. But even from the very beginning, even if they weren't outright political, Cahiers du Cinema was very ideological. It was very aesthetic in the bad sense of the word. So you could be reading, for example, one of the key essays in the journal was by one of the founders, Andre Bazin. He wrote this essay called "The Evolution of Language of Cinema," and in it he has this kind of like almost geeky fixation on having art that is hyper realistic. He turns realism into a fetish, and because he's doing this, he ends up propping up certain films at the expense of others. Yes, they ended up introducing the world to, good filmmakers like Bergman and Mizoguchi and others, but at the same time, their reasons for introducing the world to these filmmakers is it wasn't born from any kind of real intellectual discipline. They didn't have a good reason except they felt that it was the right thing. They weren't able to explain why. And if you read some of these early essays, there's all these weird aesthetic demands. A film has to be this. A film has to be that. A film cannot be this. A film cannot be that. And often it has nothing to do with what's really happening on the screen. And to me, the most interesting thing with reading this sort of criticism, it's not even in the content itself. It's not what these people were saying. It's the way that when you look at any kind of academic style writing, whether it's Cahiers du Cinema or a random journal about any topic from like 1954, if you look at these, academic libraries and, university or whatever, the style is essentially the same. Cahiers du Cinema didn't really trickle into America until the 80s. That's when a lot of it started becoming translated. That's when, people started reading it in English. And this is when it started infecting American academia with things like, post-structuralism or postmodernism and everything in between. And yet, if you read the academic journals in the 80s, and you read the academic journals in 2015, and you read Cahiers du Cinema in 1956, and you read a random, a cultural journal in some, shit-kicker college in America in 1951, the style is exactly the same. It's because these ideas are born from the same kind of mind that has no personality, cannot take any positions, is fearful, no matter outwardly confident they seem, I feel they're very fearful of the world around them. They're not really willing to engage with it in a deep and profound way. And the style is just so, it's just the same thing over and over again. It's as if, you can't tell the difference between a random writer in whatever college in America in 1952 versus an essay by Andre Bazin. It's like the same thing. And it's the same thing in the 80s. And despite the fact that, the influence of the journal came to us so late, in effect, we were doing the same exact shit in America for those 30 years before the journal even came to America. And why is that? It's because it was born from the same kind of very limited mind. It's born from the same limits, the same flaws. It's just that Kaye Cinema was able to take these flaws and make them popular, was able to, turn celebrities out of their writers, celebrities out of their filmmakers, and yet it's essentially no different than the kinds of stuff that we had in America 30 years before.
Well, I want to end this Agee, since he was brought up earlier, and I think Agee was probably the first film writer of any note that went beyond just reviewing, and I think he's a seminal figure in actual film criticism, especially in America, and I think he did have an influence on the Kaye crowd. So let's end this segment, and in our final segment, I want to talk about film criticism here in the 21st century and online, and if that's had a good or bad effect when we talked about the democratization of criticism. And we'll do that when we get back. All right, this is our final segment, and I want to bring us back to the present, because we've started with what film criticism is, talked a little bit about the history of it. We're in the year 2015 as I record this show, and probably for the last decade or so, the biggest film website online, I believe, is Rotten Tomatoes, and there are other sites like Metacritic, MRQE, and a host of sites that really I don't think are film sites. They're more or less just sort of film fan kind of sites, because they basically aggregate the reviews of
Aggregator.
Yeah, they aggregate the reviews of 100, 200 critics, whatever, and then they give it either a numerical 55 out of 100. Whoop, Rick, are you there? Rick? Okay, Rick is coming back. So either they give them a score on 1 to 100, or on Rotten Tomatoes they give them a fresh tomato or a rotten tomato. And are you there, Rick?
I'm here.
Okay. And so let's talk about what the opinions of the aggregator sites are, because one of the things, and I'll just throw this out, that I think is bad about them is it contributes to something that came before the internet, which is what I call critical cribbing, wherein you would get a famous critic like a Roger Ebert who would say something about, say, Taxi Driver, and that meme, something gets picked up by other writers, secondary Detroit Press or the Peoria News or the Springfield Gazette or whatnot, and whether or not it's correct or not, it gets repeated. And this was especially true, I think, during what I think Rick called the heroic age of film going, because I know when I look back at a lot of the films of the 1960s, things like Last Year at Marienbad, Blow Up, there's a lot of misinformation about the characters' names that didn't appear in the films. They were nameless characters. And one critic, like a Crowther, then would say, would look at, say, the supplement that came about the film, and wouldn't look at the film. They would get a lot of the film, the substance of their review, I think, from the PR material. And I think this is caught on in the last, or this early part of the century, especially online, where you'll have a film critic who's maybe a featured reviewer on Rotten Tomatoes, maybe he writes for San Francisco Chronicle or something, and then everyone starts repeating the same misinformation. So let me start with that premise. Aggregator sites, this critical cribbing, the misinformation, opinions. Bill or Rick, do you want to go first?
Well, I'll hop in. One of the things I did here in Montpelier was I was the programming director for a yearly event that still happens called the Green Mountain Film Festival. And starting in 2002, we had each year a visiting film critic that I would interview. And it was really interesting that every year this conversation would get more and more kind of intense and panicked about what the future of film criticism was. You see what changed between the years 2002 and 2009 as newspaper after newspaper went under, and really respected critics were all of a sudden without a platform. And our final year that I did this critic interview was, oddly enough, with Gerald Peary, who had just done his own movie called For the Love of Movies, a history of film criticism. And he and a critic who had been there the year before, Godfrey Cheshire, both talked about this decline of newsprint as a contributing factor to the simultaneous rise of the aggregator sites, and that anybody could have a film blog and get linked up to whatever aggregator site it was, and people who really were interested, let's say 20 years ago, in reading what Anthony Lane had to say, David Denby, Richard Schickel. Now it's very confusing about where do you go to read a critic who approaches a film with a real sense of nuance. So in that way, these aggregator sites are the kind of the current version of the Siskel and Ebert of is it thumbs up or thumbs down, and with very little attention paid to the substance of the film. Godfrey Cheshire, who was a very, very good critic, and also became a filmmaker, and did a documentary about family history, a great film I thought called Moving Midway, and which dealt with issues of race and Southern heritage. And he was shocked to find out that the film was not going to open in Atlanta. And the reason that the distributor decided not to open the film in Atlanta was because the Atlanta Constitution had recently let their film critic go, and felt that the film wasn't going to get any kind of good write-up or good publicity. It wasn't worth the expense of opening it there. So it's a very perilous scene, and on the one hand, it's like everybody can be a film critic, and that was the subject of Ebert's wonderful book called Your Movie Sucks. So
do you think that gets out about films has increased with these aggregator sites?
Yeah, I think so. There's a certain, as Alex put it, the lowest common denominator thing. What's the thing that everybody knows about this movie? And sometimes it's not accurate at all.
Okay, how about you, Bill?
Well, I don't know. I feel like a bit of an outlier in this discussion. I don't rely on critics very much for anything having to do with the film before I see it. I make it a point, and I have for many decades now, not to read anything about a movie until I see it myself. And then after I've watched the film, usually within a day, I'll write my own review. And then after that, I'll go and I'll fish around. I'll go to some of the aggregated sites simply as a convenient compilation of what other people thought about this particular film to see if they saw anything that I didn't see. But there's nobody who I look to rely on to guide me for films. I just see what's happening with playing the festivals, and there's the only critic, believe it or not, the only critic who I actually pay attention to now is Mark Kermode, who does capsule reviews on the BBC, and I just find him fascinating as a character. Very articulate guy. Again, I disagree with almost everything he says, but I love his enthusiasm for what he does for film. But he's about the only guy I regularly read now, or regularly listen to.
Okay. How about you, Alex? Your comments on aggregator sites and if they have a positive or a negative effect?
I agree with the comments so far as far as I don't really look at reviews prior to watching a film unless I have to. Definitely prior to writing about a film, I try not to look at anything. I don't want to be colored in this way. To go into it, I think it's just a bad habit. It makes you kind of lazy. It makes you more reliant on others. As far as the aggregator sites. I mean, yes, you see this all the time. I think probably in recent years, the most kind of the most dramatic example of this is, if you guys go online right now and you Google "midnight in Paris," in quotation marks, plus the phrase "love letter" or "love poem," you're gonna get hundreds of reviews that call Woody Allen's "Midnight in Paris" either a love letter or a love poem. Do the same thing to Manhattan, but call it New York. Love letter to New York. Love letter to, love poem or whatever. They do this all the time. They have nothing to say about the film, so they do this most obvious thing. And it's funny because it's like, this is like one of the biggest cliches, and I'm not sure if they realize it's a cliche or not, but they just go balls to the wall with this. They just love to include this in the criticism. You have like little things like that. You have four bigger tropes. One thing that I was surprised about was, Roger Ebert does have a pretty big cultural effect as far as film is concerned, and yet his take on Manhattan was not the take that film goers had. They had a much more superficial take where they sort of accepted the film's illusions when Roger Ebert was arguing the opposite. But definitely now with more and more people writing and seeing these reviews everywhere, you definitely will have this kind of theft. I mean, it's inevitable. The other part of it is, it's very silly if you think about how the system works. I mean, if you have, for example, a great film that's released, and for whatever reason it's cut down the middle. 50% of critics think it's a great film. 50% think that it's a horrific film. You're going to have a score of 50%. It's almost, but the fact is, only one of those people can be right. It's either a great film or it's a terrible film. Yes, it could be in between, but assume that it's a great film. One is right and one is wrong. This fact, reality doesn't get split across into a percentage. That's just stupid. That's not how things work. But if you look at reviews like this and you look at these kinds of scores and you take them seriously, you're unconsciously you're splitting reality into these kinds of percentages, and it's just silly. The only way that you could really trust, and this is interesting, the only way you could really trust these review sites is for the following. Number one, if they're reviewing something that's like completely lowest common denominator. Like if you're looking at video game reviews, I'd say 99% of the time, like if you have like a video game that scores really well, it's probably a pretty good game as far as such low level things are concerned. Or if you have a film that's released and it has a score of like 7% or 4%, all that means is, it's most likely a bad film. It probably doesn't even follow the bare minimum of, a script that's in any way logical, or, it could be just so put together in an amateur way that, all the lighting is off, the camera's just so shaky and adds nothing, So if you look at, LCD stuff, reviews tend to be pretty good. You look at video games, or you look at horrible films, those things tend to be accurate. But if you try to get a review for a great film, you can't trust reviews for a great film. That kind of nuance humans cannot handle. They can handle the general mediocrity of the bell curve. They can handle everything in the middle. They can't handle the outliers. It's just not going to happen. So, that's my general view of these aggregate sites.
Well, let me just make one comment. I think one of the things too that makes the aggregator sites poor is that there's a constant need to provide content. When you have these film blogs, or especially if they're not personal film blogs tend to be a little bit better, I think, than a lot of these sites where you have a page and you'll have 50 shots from the movie, camera shots from the movie, and you have 3 sentences and then a picture, 3 sentences and then a picture. This need to provide content, as they call it online. So that's my take on it. Well, let's wrap up this show here, and I'll give each of you a final say on whatever you want. We've talked about the current film criticism situation. We went back in history. We talked a little bit about film and what film criticism is. Alex, I'll let you go first, and then I'll go around the horn with the other 2 guys. Give me any your final thoughts on film criticism, where we are now, and what you think the future might hold.
I think the present is basically it's a predictable effect of any kind of demonic movement. If you have any kind of tendency towards average, if you have more and more people involved in any kind of project, it's going to dilute the project in the middle. You're not going to affect the outliers. The outliers of the extremely terrible or the really great. They're still going to keep coming, perhaps not in the same ratio, but they're going to be there. But the middle is definitely affected, and it looks skewed in that way. I don't think in the long run it's really that important. But the one good thing I could say about this kind of based on mediocrity is I do strongly feel that the future of humanity in the next century it's a tendency towards mediocrity, and that's a good thing. Whether it's things like poverty or violence, around the world, or hunger around the world, or people's access to the arts, or whatever it might be. Our tendency is to sort of deal with these concrete problems, and to do away with these concrete problems so that everybody's more or less on the same page. I think when people finally get on the same page, when people, when it comes to film, say, when people are able to argue, if not well, then at least be able to use evidence in some fashion, be able to say, yes, when it comes to criticism, there needs to be some kind of objective standard. Yes, when it comes to art, there are specific things that we need to look for. When people have this general sense of, this is what we need to do, this is going to be a springboard for higher things that happen. This is true of society in terms of, physical problems that we're dealing with, whether it's hunger or anything else in between, and it has to do with intellectual pursuits as well. So I think as silly and as maddening as this tendency towards mediocrity is, I think our future is one of mediocrity, and I think when it concerns most people because we just have so many on opposite ends, I think it's a good thing. Because the outliers will always be there. You shouldn't concern yourself with what's happening in the middle so much. You should concern yourself with what's happening at the very highest, points of human existence. This is what we need to be looking at. It's not about, what's the guy down the street think about this or that film, or, is, my plumber, watching Bergman. That's not as important as what's happening on the outside, what's happening on the margins. And the margins over time, they will improve. As good as art might have been 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, the highest art today is higher than it was because we as a whole have improved. It's because the outliers were able to use these improvements and kind of almost hyper exaggerate these outliers, make them better. That's the point. That's what people need to focus on. Don't worry about the middle. The middle is always going to be there. Take it for what it is.
Okay, Bill, do you have a final comment, Bill Moranci?
Yeah, I largely agree with what Alex just said. I think not just film, but the vast majority of any artistic endeavor is going to produce mediocrity. And our job as critics and film appreciators is to find the things that stand out, that actually advance the cause and advance the art form. And I have to say, I'm very optimistic about the future of cinema. I think we are on an incredible roll. Just last year, a movie called Timbuktu came out. How many people, other than as a bad joke, how many people didn't know what Timbuktu was? And yet, here's this guy with no money who made a perfectly legitimate, thought-provoking, and actually, I think, in part, profound observation about what was happening in Timbuktu. And that 5 to 10 good, better than good, that 5 to 10 excellent films are still being pumped out somewhere in the air. For a while, Iran was producing some outstanding work, and then it moved over to Korea. Japan is always reliable. Korea, I think, is making world-class work, routinely world-class work. So I'm very optimistic. I'm 7 years old in a week's time, and I can't wait to go back to the movies.
Rick, final comment from you about film and its criticism and what the future holds.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that phrase that Alex used about outliers, and going back to that Philip Lopate's term about the heroic age of moviegoing, that we've seen over the last, my adult life, getting into movies as a teenager and until right now, is this the lack of opportunity to see these films. On the one hand, you could say that the internet has created more opportunity to see these films, but the decline of criticism has meant a decline of people really ready to champion these films, to talk about them, who have a platform to tell you that you should not miss Timbuktu, for instance. We had a time when the movies were movies from France, Czechoslovakia, Japan were opening in theaters, if not necessarily all over America, in most of the cosmopolitan areas. Now, a lot of the films that we wound up, seeking out, going to see as young film buffs are now, many of them are confined to the festival circuit. So it takes you have to be the film version of a truffle hunter to kind of to get them out, and it always helps to have somebody could be in a very rarefied form like Sight and Sound magazine or Film Comment magazine to say, I saw this movie on the festival circuit and watch for it. It's going to be really good. Sometimes it will appear on DVD, sometimes it won't. I used to keep a long list of the movies that would get great reviews and variety at the various festivals around the world, hoping against hope that they would get a U.S. distributor, and maybe 50% did. With the rise of streaming and everything that's available on the internet, sure, some things are perhaps more available than they used to be, but I really miss the lively discussion and arguments over whether this particular film should be worth seeing. And that's what I've learned the most about the state of film criticism. I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, I wanted to thank all three of the fellows on tonight, Alex Sheremet, Bill Moranci, and Rick Winston. Bill and Rick have a cable access show in Vermont called Talking About Movies, and I think you can find, are all of your shows online on Vimeo?
Right now, I've got 196 of our shows posted on video.
Okay, well, anyone wanting to look and find that can look below this video and can find a link to their Vimeo site. And again, thank you to all of you. If you enjoyed this conversation on film criticism and its history and its effect on film, keep watching more Dan Schneider video interviews over the months, because we'll have similar topics on the arts, on science, and so forth. So again, thanks to all three of you.